So we will kick this off. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today about feature flags and authorization and the keys that it really unlocks for you in your modern development. I am Alex Olivier. I'm the Chief Product Officer and co-founder here at Cerbos, which is an authorization solution. I'm very pleased we have Ben Rometsch joining us, who's the CEO and co-founder of Flagsmith. Hey, Ben, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I was just moaning to you about the British weather earlier, and it's still raining. So other than that, I'm great.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm in the UK as well and have equally bad weather, just north of London. I promise we won't talk about the weather too much because that's too British of us on this. Um,
We can talk
today's
about
topic,
tea.
I'll be absolutely tea. There's a bit too, yeah, maybe tea. It's a bit after tea time. Today we're going to talk about authorization feature flags. Ben, I think you are best placed out of anyone, given what you're doing with Flagsmith and your involvement with some of the open projects around feature flags as well. So please give us a bit of introduction, kind of how you got into this world and with feature flags and kind of what your mission is for everyone to make their lives better.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Flagsmith. We are a commercial open source feature flagging project. You can find us on github.com/flagsmith. My background, I was running a software agency in London for 25 years, and Flagsmith was a side project that we started at that agency to build a feature flagging platform that, in our own vision, basically. And that started as a side project, was open sourced, started to get some interest. And then just before COVID, I started working on that project full time by myself. So it's very lonely memories in that little room during various COVID lockdowns. And now we're a team of 15 all around the world as a remote first company, working on the platform, the SDKs, all that sort of stuff. And I'm also on the governance board of Open Feature, which has been really fascinating sort of project to work on. So Open Feature, which maybe talk about a little bit towards the end, is kind of analogous to Open Telemetry. If people know about that, it's trying to build a common SDK standard for feature flags to try and help, prevent flagging companies from having to reinvent the SDK wheel all the time, and to help with avoidance of vendor lock-in and all that sort of stuff. So most of my day job is Flagsmith, but yeah, it's fun to work on Open Feature and meet people from very, very different disciplines and whatnot. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, super excited to speak to you because I feel like there's a lot of similarities between what we do with Cerbos and what you're doing with Flagsmith. Our timelines as a company are the same. Like we are a commercial open source solution for authorization. So the Cerbos project up on GitHub again, Cerbos github.com/Cerbos. We have our open core, and then we have the commercial control plane Cerbos hub that sits on top, and equally working on kind of these standards as well. So we're part of the OpenID working group around standardizing authorization. So it's always nice to speak to someone that's basically we're at the same point. We are trying to build this layer that makes it basically developers' lives easier as much as we can, and hopefully build a business around it at the same time. So as we kind of hinted at the start, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this session is when we're talking to users that are trying to implement authorization, one of the topics that comes up quite a lot is around, okay, what's authorization? What's feature flags? What's the scope of each? Where's the overlap? Are they the two sides of the same coin? Are they kind of separate concerns? And I guess to kind of kick that off, Ben, it'd be good if you kind of go through the use cases you see. When should you use feature flags? When do you see the commonly used feature flags? And then we can sort of have a bit of an overlay of how that works with authorization as well.
Yeah, okay. So when you shouldn't use them is when you're doing anything around security. That would be my first suggestion. I mean, there's always exceptions in engineering, right? But generally, if you're worried about the security of something, then generally, yeah, don't go here. There's dragons here. Go and use a tool that's designed for that. But feature flagging is an interesting engineering concept in that it's very, very simple. the core use case is very, very simple. And the benefit that you get from that core use case generally is as much as we see from the people that use Flagsmith and open feature is really, really a lot of value added to teams. So that core use case is trying to decouple deploying software and releasing features, and generally use feature flag. That's the general use case for using feature flags. So most of our and the backstory to Flagsmith, and the reason that we built it as an agency as this side project, was we just had enterprise customers who could not sort of release versions of their applications without something burning or setting on fire, or teams getting fried, having to work weekends, because they were working in larger organizations with multiple dependencies amongst teams, and their feature releases was tied and coupled to their application deployments. And quite often those deployments were happening at 3 a.m. by some poor DevOps or SRE person, and then if things break and all this sort of stuff. So feature flagging, which we'll go through in a little bit, really just allows you to, that's the core. If you only think about or remember one thing from this call, it would be like they just decouple deploying your software with releasing your features. And that one very, very simple sort of step of progress, especially amongst larger teams or teams that have to go through a lot more of a ceremony to release their software, because they're in a bank or financial services institution or whatever, can be transformational to those teams. So it's not much software, and it's a lot about process and humans. Maybe a little bit, I think maybe Cerbos a little bit, the ratio is a little bit less, but software people and engineers always like to try and slaps loads of software on stuff, but feature flags are pretty simple, and they're very much around helping teams become more efficient as teams of humans, as opposed to some heavy lift of software to try and do something incredible. Yeah,
I certainly have many dark memories of doing those feature releases and things going catastrophically wrong and trying to roll back at 2 a.m. and not being good. And
database migration, reversals, and all that sort of stuff. And that's another thing that we sort of experience as well, is there's a huge amount of legacy code out there, right? There's like new code is like the tip of the iceberg, and legacy code, legacy infrastructure, legacy frameworks, legacy languages, legacy databases, that's like the vast majority of software engineering out there. And I think that's something that the discipline forgets a lot. Like, that those people working in those teams kind of get forgotten about. And so, feature flags can be really, really valuable to folk like that, because, if it's, dozens of hours of labor to get a release out, then you really magnify the value of what you get out of feature flags.
And it's like, I really like the framing, like decoupling sort of releases, and then kind of that way is kind of the story we've been telling with Cerbos all along as well, which is around the security side of things, not the feature flag side of things. So what we do say is Cerbos is here to help you with authorization. And by authorization, to be very clear, we're talking about, can this user do this particular action in this particular side of the system? So an input to that we see quite a lot is feature flags. Has this person got a feature flag enabled? Have they got this particular trait set upon them? And that's an input to make an authorization decision. But if you imagine it's in a typical like SaaS application, you have a user, they belong to like a project, like inside of Flagsmith, which we'll go through shortly. You have an environment, you're inside a project, etc. So I have a role within that. You need this kind of layer which defines, okay, can Alex or can Ben do the enable flag in this environment under these kind of scenarios type logic. And kind of traditionally, you end up having to hard code all this into the application code. So if user role equals X, then allow the action. If user role equals Y, etc. And that's certainly what I did. And similarly to kind of feature flags, you end up kind of hard coding some of this logic in and trying to hack around it to a point. And the Cerbos approach is to decouple that out into a standalone externalized service, similar to you're doing with kind of feature flags as well. And the Cerbos approach is to decouple that out. You then have your authorization policy written as actual policy files rather than code. So you're not hard coded this into your application. You've decoupled this now. And so your authorization policies can evolve and change independently of your application code. And talking kind of legacy, a lot of our users that we kind of see implementing Cerbos are going through these kind of big migration type projects or kind of moving to a newer platform, and they're heavily using feature flags to kind of point users to new parts of the system or the old parts of the system. And one of those components you need to abstract as well now is, much like authentication, you need to abstract authorization so it works commonly upon it, which is why we more often than not end up having these discussions around like, should this be a feature flag or should this be an authorization piece, which is why we kind of thought it would be an interesting discussion to have with you around where are those boundaries, where do they lie? And I think the way you put it around, if it's security, that should authorization. If it's more about controls to part, then feature flags kind of makes more sense. I don't know what you're kind of seeing when users are kind of implementing flags, like kind of best practices you're pointing them towards.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where the customer's coming from. Like, it's very common for us to have and work with customers who are coming from like a big legacy, homegrown thing that they've built that's just kind of sort of grown out of control. No one wants to look after it. There's no standardization around languages. There's no kind of SDKs to think of. It's quite common for fairly hairy things to be happening around like controlling application behavior with like environment variables, like modifying environment variables, and then like bouncing services to try and modify application behavior. So it really does depend. I guess it's kind of so interesting how if you squint, Cerbos and Flagsmith kind of almost identical.
Yeah, it's
ways.
certainly.
Or like if you start off with Flagsmith, if you're starting a new project and you're literally, Git in it, whatever, there's really no drama or fanfare or anything at all, really. It just becomes part of your workflow. I'm assuming it's pretty similar with you guys, but the flip side of that is if you're coming from a legacy application, that's maybe that's the other thing as well. It's quite common for a legacy platform to have like 4 different ways of remotely modifying application behavior. Like environment variables might be one. There might be a config file somewhere on someone's laptop. There might be an admin interface to something. So if you're coming from that, then the best practices are very different. It's just about trying to chip away at that kind of edifice of like slowly moving across from where you're going from to where you're coming to. And that's why open feature is so important as well, because open features, like, you're never going to have to do, well, the goal of open feature is you're never going to have to do that again, right? Like, you can go back to your homegrown platform if you want, just need to write an open feature provider. So yeah, it really is a case of where you're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we I've got to hand you the reins, Ben, and can you kind of take us through sort of Flagsmith, good example?
It's always good to give people some concrete examples of what things look like. So hopefully I'm going to share my screen now.
Yep.
And it's actually, we just redesigned this UI, this navigation area. So I'm really excited every time I log into the platform. It's like, oh, it's new and it's loads better. We spent years trying to solve this problem. So basically, the way Flagsmith works, this is going to be a super high level, quick fire demo of a couple of ways that you can use feature flags and hopefully give people some ideas about how they might be able to use them. So this is the Flagsmith application. Flagsmith organizes itself into projects. Projects are generally applications or properties that your teams are working on. And so if I click into a project, we're looking at the Flagsmith website itself. So we use Flagsmith to deliver features into the platform itself, which is meta and fun. And this is what we're looking at here now. So projects have environments. And flags live within a project, but the values of flags can change depending on the environment you're looking at. So super simple workflow would be you start working on a new feature, you come into the Flagsmith platform and create a new flag for that feature. And then as you can see here, these are the different environments that we've got within the platform. So we only have two kind of like, production, like infrastructure environments of staging and production. And if I, and then these are the features that are associated with the platform. So you can see here, this is a metadata feature that we're working on at the moment. We've been working on it quite a while. If I change the environment from, say, staging to production here, you can see that the flags, the flag names are the same, but the values that they might take are different. And so that allows us to go through and, as we're approaching and finishing a certain feature, we might turn it on in staging, or we might turn it on for a set of users in production. What feature flag platforms allow you to do once you've got once you've got an achieved decoupling, deployment, and release, they then allow you to be much more expressive about how you release features. So you can release features to, a different class of user, users on different platforms, maybe mobile devices or different geographical regions, or who've got access to a different plan, for example. So just to give you a super quick idea, if I come to the demo feature, the demo environment, and I go to demo.flagsmith.com, you will see that this is exactly the same front end, but we're now looking at the demo environment within Flagsmith. And I've got a butter bar here. So the butter bar allows us to control messaging to the users within the platform. And currently within the demo environment, the butter bar has no value. So flags, and this is common amongst many flag providers, aren't just necessarily Booleans. They could be textual values, structured data, multivariate values if you want to drive an A/B test. But so if I say welcome to our stream, you can see here currently there's no butter bar on our demo. But if I update this feature value, you can see here that the butter bar appears on our demo application, and our text appears. And so all I'm doing is I'm remotely controlling the behavior of the application. In this example, the demo environment of the application, using flags and flag values to modify that application behavior. So when it comes to decoupling, deployment, and release, the canonical example would be you deploy your application with the flag for the feature disabled. And then, if you want to, your SRE and DevOps folk can do that at 3 a.m, if that's just the way you roll. And then, when the engineering team, the product team come in at a reasonable hour, they can just come in and turn on this feature in production and see, track the behavior of that feature, look at the telemetry coming out of the platform, and see that they're happy with it. And then obviously, if they want to, and they're like, oh, this really isn't working, we didn't think of there's some consideration we didn't make with regards to the production environment, they can just turn it off and it will disappear. So just to give you a super quick example, that's modifying the behavior of the application from a particular environment. So everyone accessing that environment can see that change. But you can also apply user context to that feature value. So I can say, for example, I want to, in the demo environment, I've just found my particular user that I'm identifying by. I can come in and I can provide a specific butter bar value for my individual user into that demo environment. So I can turn it on just for me, which is super powerful. Testing in production against production data, production APIs and services, I can do this just as an individual user. And then I can also provide context to users. So we call that context traits. these are key value pairs of data that you can apply and you provide via our SDKs to the flag evaluation engine. Just very briefly, I don't want to spend too long on this demo. We can define a segment which makes use of those traits. So segments are just collections or groups of users based on a set of rules. And here we have a Flagsmith team. I guess Kyle's been demoing this, so we can delete him. This is a simple segment, and it is basically just saying if the email trait of the user matches this regular expression, then include them in this Flagsmith team segment. So effectively, anyone logging in with a flagsmith.com email address is going to be a member of this segment. Once I've defined that, I can come back to my butter bar and I can basically say to the platform, right, for Flagsmith team members, I want them to say, welcome Flagsmith team. And I will update that segment override for the butter bar. And you can see that this message is showing. This is going to show for everyone who logs into the platform with a flagsmith.com domain and no one else. So that just gives you a bit of an idea about, a lot of different flag providers kind of similar in this way, where you can be much more expressive about how you release features, who you're releasing features to. That then opens the doors for doing things like A/B and multivariate tests, but using the flag engine to bucket your user behaviors, doing things like percentage rollout. So saying I want 1% of my user population to see this feature. And then, if nothing is on fire, I want to up that to 10 to 50 to 100%. Very, very expressive around this sort of stuff. So the initial use case, very, very simple. We generally see customers taking on board those simple use cases, but then as they get more confident with the pattern and the approach, they start to use the platform in much more expressive ways. And yeah, you can download everything that I've seen. I've just shown you. This is all open source. You can grab it, have it up and running on your laptop in a few minutes, and yeah, start hacking around with the tool.
So someone that is always like looking at how we're rolling out Cerbos as our product, we've got new features coming out very, very soon. And one thing that we're actively talking about is like, okay, how do we control these and how we feature flag these? And my brain immediately runs to the concern of like, how do I not end up with like a proliferation of too many feature flags and too many segments, or that I can see that list getting longer and longer and longer. Have you got any kind of like best practice or kind of recommendations for when to use feature flag? What's the hygiene around them? When do you clear them up? Those sort of things that you see.
Yeah, so that's and there's a lot of tooling in Flagsmith to help you with that. There's generally kind of different classes of flags. So there are long-lived flags that like the butter bar, for example, that's going to live for the lifetime of the platform, I would expect, because it's always useful to be able to say, I need to tell users in a particular environment something optionally, right? So those flags would live in the platform and in your code, for forever. But then other types of flags, if you are using it to roll out a feature, and then everyone's been using that feature, you're happy with it. The Jira ticket has been long closed, and there you go. Then yeah, there's tooling around like identifying stale flags. To promote cleanup of that code. So yeah, like but there's a lot of different. Our customers use the platform in very, very different ways, because it's such a general tool. So yeah, it's always interesting to see how people are using it, and there are fairly obvious like bad ways to use the platform, and we've seen some kind of like crazy, we've seen people use it to do string localization, for example, and things like that. Yeah. Just because, if you can dynamically, control the behavior application, then yes, you can start doing all sorts of stuff. And sometimes we get asked, is there a language runtime in you know, on the client side and things like that, like, you know, can we feed it code and things like that? And it's like, it's not really, you know, what we've designed it for, but yeah, you know, it's generally quite obvious if you're doing something wrong, or if you're doing an anti-pattern, but there's a lot of stuff that we've written and thought about and published on our website about best practices. And actually, open feature really is kind of like, we are really trying to distill down a bunch of different projects and their learnings and try and get a common denominator of the best way to do things. Yeah.
And what does like a typical sort of integration look like? Obviously, you've got SDKs for most of the languages, APIs and such. What does it take to actually go and integrate Flagsmith into an application?
Yeah, so if you're using our SaaS platform, it's literally, within 5 minutes, you can have the SDK running in, I don't know, your JavaScript application, your React Native application, your iOS application. And then, yeah, like the actual code that you're writing is really, really simple. It's a conditional base. It's like, here's an environment key, grab my flags. What's the state? What's the value of this flag? Is it on or off, or just emit the textual value somewhere into the application? So yeah, there's the SDKs are very, very lightweight. They have like a handful of methods, and I guess very similar to yours, right? It's like you most of the time they're just your SDK is either giving a true or a false, right? Like yeah. So the actual amount of kind of like stuff you need to get clear in your head around a code level is very, very, very simple. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually we had a question come in during that around. You mentioned you kind of got the SaaS offering as well, but there's the open source project. And there's a question here from Raghunath around. Can you kind of run Flagsmith inside of your own cluster, inside your own environment?
Yeah, you certainly can. So the most common method of deploying Flagsmith, if you're not running on our SaaS, so if you want to run it yourself in your own infrastructure, is through Kubernetes. So yeah, we've got a Helm chart. We regularly deploy directly into our customers' infrastructure, on one of the cloud providers, or they run it on their bare metal. Actually, that's been one of the interesting things is, when we started on the project 5 years ago, the deployment story for on-premise was much more complicated. There was Rancher, there was a couple of other orchestration frameworks. There was like Docker Swarm, and it was much more complicated answer to that question, like how do we deploy Flagsmith? But it's been kind of interesting. Like, yeah, I can't remember the last time someone wanted to deploy it not in Kubernetes. So yeah, we've got very much first class support for Kubernetes, and that's the most common way that it exists in Kubernetes way more than anywhere else, for sure.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're seeing as well with kind of people deploying Cerbos. We have a similar story with Helm charts and those kind of things. I would say the one other environment we see quite a lot in is more of these serverless container runtimes. So Cloud Runs or Amazon ECS as kind of, I would say, the number 2 spot. But I think we're now mostly beyond the days of bare metal machines and running executable binaries directly on them, which is a relief, especially now you've got to worry about like ARM or an x86 instruction sets and all that fun stuff. Cool. So thank you for that, Ben, and just anyone that's listening in, feel free to fire away questions in the chat. We'll get back to those. I'm gonna just jump back in and drive for a bit. So bear with me. So when we were kind of preparing for this session, and as I said, kind of at the start, we used to get asked a fair bit around, what's authorization, what should be feature flags, how do those two things work together? And so what we have is a bit of a demo that basically combines Flagsmith with Cerbos and kind of gives that end-to-end flow around using feature flags to influence authorization decisions, and then using authorization decisions to influence how basically the user experience behaves. So just a bit of scene setting before we kind of dive into that and kind of show that off. I've said this authorization word a few times now. Unfortunately, it sounds very familiar to authentication. And it's even worse cases when it gets reduced down to auth C and auth N. They are two different concepts. So authentication, just make sure we're on the same page, is about you ensuring the person is who they say they are. So you challenge someone to provide a credential, username, password, etc. And they get back an identity that you're pretty sure is who they say they are. Whilst authorization is around, okay, you now know who someone is. Can they actually do something, or can they perform a particular action inside of a system? And this probably looks very familiar to what you'd use with the Flagsmith SDK, but you end up with basically these if statements in your code. And if you were to hard code authorization logic similar to feature flags, you're going to put in things like, okay, let's work out this person is an employee. So you'd have, if the user's email includes the company domain name, kind of the example you were showing, then they should be able to access a certain capability. Or you might look at what package someone has. You want to work out if someone belongs to a certain group, whether they should have access or not. You may go down to more things that are like data locality or data security specific, and generate audit logs around access controls. And this logic gets kind of brittle, and as you start having more and more of these requirements come in, the fine being able to get very fine grained in your authorization logic is actually a bit of a maintenance overhead. And anytime you want to go and change that authorization logic, you're going to have to go and update your code base all over the place. And similarly with flags, if you want to enable a feature, you can just flick a switch in Flagsmith versus having to do a whole new release of the application. So the kind of problem with that approach, authorization logic is now going to be spread out. If you hard code it across all your different apps and services, you might have a React Native app, you might have an iOS app, you have an Android app, you have a web app, you have some API access, and you need to have standardized authorization across all those. So updating it is going to be very painful. You have to go and take ultimately that business logic and convert it into n number of languages based on however many services or frameworks you have in your stack. And then documentation becomes a bit of a nightmare because you now have this logic spread out across different parts of your code base. So what Cerbos does with authorization, similar to Flagsmith does with feature flags, is it kind of extracts all that out and decouples it out into something that's much more standardized, is a single pane of glass, as it were, to see exactly what's going on. And when it comes to authorization, Cerbos does this via policy. So rather than hard coding who can do what inside of a system, you define your authorization logic as static policy files. And we use YAML. We talk about Kubernetes. I think YAML is here to stay, love it or hate it. But as a way of basically defining conventions, Cerbos uses YAML as well as common expression language to defining conditions. And basically your policy files are defining, here are the different resource types in my system, here are the different actions that are possible, and under which condition. And you can do your simple role-based access control checks. So does this person have a role or not? Or you can get more to the fine-grained attribute-based control checks, where you're actually inspecting individual attributes about the user making the request or the resource they're trying to access. And where this overlaps with kind of feature flags is these attributes can come from anywhere. They can come from your identity provider, they can come from your internal database, or in this case, they could come from your feature flagging system. So attributes about the user can include what flags they have turned on. And then you can start making authorization decisions actually at the API kind of security level. Should this request be allowed or not? That can be dependent on whether a particular flag is ultimately enabled. So in terms of a bit of demo, architecture, sort of how this works. If we imagine we're looking at like a single request going through the system, and we're going to look at how that intersects with the feature flags, how it intersects with Cerbos, how it intersects with the rest of parts of your app. So you have your end users, they're on one of those client devices. That client device might have locally on it feature flags as well, using one of the Flagsmith SDKs, but ultimately there's going to be API calls going off to some backend infrastructure, and that's probably going to be running in a Kubernetes cluster in some hyperscaler somewhere. But that request comes in, and when that request comes in, you really know a few different things. You know who's making the request, because that request is going to be authenticated. So you can go to your authentication provider, Okta, Auth0, Cognito, Firebase, these kind of solutions. You can go look up that user's identity. You can also then go off to using the Flagsmith SDKs, go and grab what feature flags that user has enabled or whatever config they have enabled. So using your like butterbar example, you can go and fetch, okay, the butterbar is enabled and it has these particular values. And these are basically attributes that you can associate with the user. The other thing based on the request is what resource they're trying to access. So we're going to be looking at like an expenses tracking application. So imagine you've just gone to a conference, you want to file your expenses for work, and that needs to be approved by finance or your manager, etc. So based on the request, you might have an approve endpoint that is going to do the approve action. So from that request, you can go out to the database, go and fetch that particular record, and then make an authorization decision. And then rather than hard coding it, the Cerbos approach decouples that out into a standalone service that runs right alongside your application. So your application is now going to send a request from your service to a Cerbos instance. And in that payload will be the principal, so the user making the request, who they are, their ID, their teams, their groups, what feature flags they have enabled at that moment in time, and also the resource they're trying to access or do an action upon. So here's an expense, ID 123, it's for $10,000 for this event, etc. And then what actions are trying to be done: create, read, update, delete, approve, deny, comment, flag, whatever's relevant for that particular business domain. And that goes off to that authorization decision point. And what's loaded into that is the policies. So those kind of YAML definition files I showed you before, that contains all the business logic. So now in this example, we're actually going to go through and actually make authorization decisions based upon not only who the user is and what role they have, but whether they have particular flags enabled on them. And so again, these flags are all being sourced from the Flagsmith via their SDKs. The authorization point will make a decision. It will create an audit log of that decision. And I saw you have an audit log capabilities inside of Flagsmith as well, to really capture, this user tried to do this action, this resource, and it was either allowed or denied by this particular policy. And then what comes back to the application is a simple Boolean. Yes, this action should be allowed, or no, this shouldn't, for this particular reason. So architecturally, that's kind of how we're sticking things together, as it were, for this particular example. So here's our little demo application. It's a sort of basic React application. It's talking to a backend that's running in as a container, and there's database behind it. And the only difference here is I can actually very quickly switch between different user roles, and we can see different parts of this application are being shown and hidden and enabled and disabled and access granted based upon those authorization policies. So this is all wired up to Flagsmith. So here's our Flagsmith demo environment. I'm going to use the dark mode example. So I'm going to go and turn on dark mode as a feature flag. I'm going to go turn that on in my environment. I go and reload my application. Ta-da! Dark mode is enabled by a flag. And so that's more of a visual type check. What we've also wired up here is more like developer tools. So we have like this debug panel, which I can go and turn on, and I could also turn this on based on the targeting like you were showing us, Ben. Refresh the page. Now we get this kind of demo debug panel that shows us all the authorization decisions that are going on, etc. But the one I want to focus on is this expenses flag. So inside our application, we have this expenses section, which currently, regardless of who I'm looking at, there's no data. There's no information beyond here. So what's happening behind the scenes, every time this page is loading, it's grabbing that user's identity, it's saying to the back end, go and fetch all the expenses that this user should see. And that request is going off to Cerbos to make an authorization check. So I pulled up our authorization policy behind the scenes. So this is in Cerbos Hub, which is our management control plane for authorization. And this is our resource policy for an expense resource. So here we have an expense resource. We have some different rules. We have some different actions. So to view a resource, in this case, an expense, you must be the owner, you must be in the finance team, you must be a manager. But we also have this very blanket rule at the top that says all action should be denied unless the expenses flag is enabled for the person making the request. So architecturally, what's going on: apps loading, we're authenticating, we're going out to Flagsmith, grabbing the flags that user has enabled, we're passing them into Cerbos, and then we are making a authorization decision. Firstly, checking whether the expensive flag is enabled, and if it isn't, then we're going to deny everything and thus present like the empty state we see on the screen. But if I go and flick that switch now, enable it, that goes through, the backend will kind of update its settings, and then what we'll see in a couple of seconds is we're now getting data back. So here we're actually controlling and combining feature flagging with authorization policies with Cerbos into one solution. So we have policy-driven approach for API access, how things are controlled, things updated, but also then controlling that and influencing that based on the flags that came from Flagsmith. And so it combines those two systems together, and other parts of the application we can easily control by flags also. So what if we wanted to change this logic or kind of really do something a bit more interesting than just showing and hiding data in response here? So if we are looking at this particular expense, we have this one for Global Airlines for $12,000, and I'm currently viewing this as someone that's a member of the finance team. And we can see it, we can go into it, but we can see here I can't actually approve it. Why is that? Well, we have in our policy, we have some rules. We go and look at the approve action, which says, okay, if someone that has the role of finance is allowed to approve only if the expense is less than $10,000. So the one we were looking at was $12,000. Thus, this rule does not pass. So the allow action shouldn't be allowed. So I can actually go and update this, move this to $20,000, and we can see inside of our editor here that things have been, this action should be allowed. This is now approved. The approve action is allowed, sorry, based on our logic. Change it back, you can see that will update. So we get that kind of real-time feedback, kind of you were seeing with the Flagsmith side of things. As you change things update, you get the similar flow with Cerbos. And I can go now and kind of commit this change and push this policy. So if I actually go and do that and show you how things are wired up, if you don't like code, maybe look away. But essentially what's going on inside our application to kind of enforce this is when a request comes in, we authenticate that request. So we've got a user's identity. We've instantiated the Flagsmith SDK. So we've gone and grabbed that. We're pulling through the flags. And then in our request to Cerbos, when we construct what we call our principal object, so who's the user making the request, we've got their ID, we've got their roles, we've got some attributes about them, what department they're in, etc. And then what flags they've currently got enabled based upon what's coming back. So again, combining those two together. So if I go and make that change in my policies, so I'm now doing this in VS Code, so that 10,000, I change this to 20,000. I can go and push that change, update logic. That then change goes out, pushing it up. So this is all going up to my GitHub repo. And then we have Cerbos Hub, which is our SaaS offering that manages your policies for you. And we're actually kicking up a whole CI process. So we're updating that policy, the logic's changing, builds are going in. Actually, this case, tests have failed, almost like I planned it. So test-driven approach for authorization is something that you kind of get with Cerbos, and we can test different states of the feature flags, making sure that the policy is behaving correctly based on those flags. In this case, this particular test is failing because the test says the action should be it should be denied, but actually is allowed. And in this case, if we go and look at that test case inside of here, we're saying for a finance team member over 10,000 should be deny. I should go and update that and say allow. So we didn't update our test case. We have now. Push that change. Sync that up, and then our builds go off. So what's happening behind the scenes? Cerbos Hub is building our policies, running our tests, and then it's going to go and distribute it to all of those connected instances. So my demo environment has a couple of Cerbos PDPs running, policy decision points running. This build will go through. You can see it's already generated, so all the tests are passed. We go and update all the instances that are listing out, in this case, for the Flagsmith policies. It's running, it goes out and pushes deploys, and then in a few seconds, and there we go, you can see it's already updated. So we're updating our authorization policy to, without having to redeploy our application, the exact same story that you get with Flagsmith as well, where you're decoupling that deployment with kind of the configuration. So here we're marrying up and joining together both the feature flags for showing and enabling parts of the application with the authorization policies of Cerbos to give that joined up experience where you really can do the feature flagging and security as one holistic solution. Cool. So we have some questions coming in. Ben, I don't know if you wanted to jump in then.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm interested in is like this is like the demo is a great example of like separation of concerns and also why you shouldn't use feature flags to deal with like permissioning. Can you just talk a little bit about how that would be handled on or because Flagsmith runs on the client side and the server side, right?
Yes.
And I'm curious to know the specific things you need to be conscious of if you were managing Cerbos in that environment as well, because you're running on an untrusted runtime, right?
Yeah, great question. So authorization must be done in an environment where you can trust the identity and you can basically trust the inputs. So you're always going to be doing this from your backend side of things. So when the request comes in from the client, you might pass attributes about a resource or a principal, but you should always be verifying those at the back end and then doing the check against the Cerbos instance. Now, there is a whole class of authorization checks which don't necessarily need that rigor. For example, as I was showing you, those approve and deny buttons showing up and hiding based upon user roles. with the server side, or what we call the service version of a policy decision point with Cerbos, that's running in your backend. Your backend service is making the backend API call to Cerbos, and the checks being done on server side. Now on the client side, where what you would have to do if you wanted to check permission, you would normally have to like round trip to your backend, so client to backend to Cerbos to client to backend, etc. Which works and is certainly a viable solution. But for those groups, those types or those types of checks where it doesn't really matter if the permission maybe is necessarily wrong because you're going to re-verify it on the back end anyway. We offer what we call an embeddable policy decision point or embedded policy decision point, where we actually, as part of our SaaS offering, we take your same policies that you've written once and we compile them for two outputs. One is for the version that's running in the backend, but we also compile it down to what we call our embedded policy decision point, which is actually powered by WebAssembly. And you can push that down to the client. So it could be a browser, but equally could be a mobile app or a serverless edge function or some use case for it. And that allows you to very quickly do locally on client or on the edge authorization checks where you already know the user, you already know the resource because you've loaded it into the web page already, onto the client already. And you can very quickly fire off those checks locally and do those more conditional UI-based things. And given you have a client SDK with Flagsmith, you have all the feature flags which are available on the client anyway. And then it kind of completes the journey. Then you do the checks on the client side using the embedded SDK, using the client input from Flagsmith. Then on the server side, you revalidate that check with the actual real confirmed data from your real database rather than something that potentially could have been untrusted, let's say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, Flagsmith's got a similar notion where our server-side SDKs can run the entire evaluation engine within our SDK. So yeah, there's actually some flag providers that are using WebAssembly to do that. We decided to like implement our evaluation engine like natively in the languages that we support on the server side, but because they're running in a trusted environment, they can basically grab the entire set of data around a particular environment and then do those evaluations all in memory. So they get like, extreme performance. And actually our larger customers, that are running like, fleets of pods, in the, tens of thousands. They're generally running our SDKs and what we call local evaluation mode, because they get like, just it will scale forever basically. So yeah, it's really interesting. There's like a very, very reflective similarity between the two platforms in terms of whether they're running in trusted or untrusted environments. Yeah.
And I think, I'm sure you get this question as well, where we're now in a world where client applications aren't necessarily always online and connected. How do you handle the degraded connection state, let's say, or the classic gone through a tunnel, haven't got a signal?
Yeah.
How does it kind of thing? So yeah, I think there's always going to be sort of like hybrid deployment model where you do on client, but then reconfirm or recheck on the back end as well. And
then also like with that as well, there's frameworks like Next where it can be really actually it's kind of interesting how sometimes Next can be quite hard to reason about where the code that you're writing is actually going to be run. Like, is it going to be run on a GitHub CI runner, or is it going to be run on like a browser or what have you? So yeah, like Next is actually one of the frameworks that we have kind of like first class support for. And yeah, it's kind of hairy sometimes trying to figure out how to reason about what a reasonable expectation of behavior would be for those sorts of things. Definitely like those things are becoming more complicated. But that's one of the things that actually when we started working on Flagsmith, we were thinking about the API and the performance of the API and the dashboard and what that would look like and what the functionality would be. But actually, like a huge amount of the energy of the engineering team goes into the SDKs, like supporting frameworks like React Native and things like that. And that again, like that's one of the reasons that we're putting our whatever weight we can muster behind open feature because, you know, down the line, I don't know, a good example is open telemetry, right? Like it would be a big lift for us to put like open telemetry tracing into all of our SDKs. That's something that is being worked on with an open feature at the open feature level, and then our provider, which is kind of like a little plugin for that, whatever language you're talking about, we don't have to worry about open feature. That's like a delegated concern. So yeah, like that's been one of the things that's been a constant like sort of surprise almost, which is how much work the SDKs take, and also expectation of quality from people using the platform in terms of SDKs. Like a few years ago, we went through and redesigned the interfaces to all of the server-side SDKs when we built out local evaluation mode, actually, to make them all consistent. Like obviously some are camel case, some are snake case, etc., and some have slightly different idioms around how you would expect them to work based on, you know, the language. But yeah, like, and that was like, you know, it was a huge amount of work, and our API surface for our SDKs is really small as well, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we've similar thing. Like we have these two API endpoints, and we've actually done a lot of work to generate our SDKs from the underlying protobuf gRPC definitions that the PDP works, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work, depending on how nice your language of choice supports gRPC. But as you speak of SDKs, we've had some questions come in around, frameworks. There was a question around for Flagsmith, how does the annotation at configuration in Spring Boot differ from feature flags?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I mean, the main thing is that you know, as far as I understand it, like you'd need to do a redeployment for a change of that annotation to take effect. So you could possibly wire up that actual annotation code to a flag.
Okay.
You know, I guess that's something that would be feasible. Yeah, the thing that you need to get your head around is like that there, and this is a you know, this is a consideration that you have to give when you're implementing, you know, flagging tools or tools like Cerbos, is like you are giving up a little bit of the control of like the you know, the runtime behavior, you know, the code paths in your application. You are seeding those up to a flag engine or an authorization engine, and you know, it is a little bit of a leap of faith in terms of doing that, and I think slowly but surely, you know, engineering teams and companies are coming around to the idea that that the benefits outweigh you know, the negative aspects of that. But you know, there are considerations you have to make around I don't know, like a good example is like the support team that, you know, are supporting your customers using the application, and they, you know, they log in as that, you know, particular organization and see a different set of buttons as someone else. So, you know, you do, and I'm sure, you know, your customers have the same, you know, you talk to your customers about the same thing, is, you know, it's not just the engineering team that this is relevant to. It flows through everyone who's involved in the organization, who has some connection, or you know, touches upon that application in some way, because it's important for, you know, everyone involved to be understanding of what's going on, really. Yeah, and you know, once people get used to it and it becomes part of that regular sort of like life cycle of developing and deploying your application, then everyone gets into it. But it's important that it's not just yeah, it's not just the engineers that it's important for.
Yeah, it's very easy to get too involved with just the technology without realizing it's the people and process that's around it as well that kind of makes these things successful across the board, and to ultimately enable you to keep delivering value and delightful user experiences. Another question came in around what's the most unique or interesting way you've seen feature flags being used?
Yeah,
You hinted at this earlier.
I get asked this a lot. I mean, we did have one customer who was having some performance issues, and we couldn't get to the bottom of it. And then they did a screen share with us, and we discovered that they had like 13,000 feature flags or something, because they were doing like, the flag names were like Spanish dot dashboard dot logout. And then I should have used an example of I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know what the Spanish one is.
Come on the spot.
And then like German dot dashboard dot logout. And so yeah, that was like we were a little bit kind of like, oh, we never really thought about that use case. So yeah, that was an interesting one. And then that's the other interesting thing about a general tool is we never thought that someone would put 13,000 flags into one environment, right? But of course people will, because if there's lots of people using the platform, they'll do things that to them work, right? So that's been another thing that I've always been surprised about. Like like the failure modes, the performance considerations you have to make, dealing with people who are on, like a lot of mobile devices in the world are on very, very, very data limited network connections as well, right? And you can't just assume that they can download like 2 megabytes of configuration data. If you're in London, like great, yeah, yeah, so that's been another thing that's been interesting as well. I need to mind the team actually for a better answer to this question, because I'm sure that there's some other better ones out there, but the 13,000 flag localization strings is the one that comes to mind. Yeah.
Fair enough. A couple more in here about kind of the Cerbos side of things around deployments. So Cerbos runs similarly to Flagsmith offering directly in your Kubernetes cluster. So you run it, deploy it as another service. We actually recommend running it as a sidecar, because that way as your application scales, Cerbos scales with it. So you always have the same node guarantees that the service is running right alongside your app, keep latency nice and snappy. And then round kind of the SDKs, automated testing for Cerbos rules. Yes, as you're writing your policies, as you kind of saw in the IDE, we give you that feedback loop visually, but we have CLI tooling again as part of the open source project that you can run locally in your dev environment, and we have VS Code support and such, so you get nice IntelliSense and autocomplete of your actual policies to fit into kind of your actual workflows. Cool. So we've got 1 minute left. Ben, thank you very much for joining me today. Where can people find you? Where can people find out more about Flagsmith and Open Feature?
Yeah, so flagsmith.com. Otherwise, I'm going to get told off by Anna and Mir, who run marketing for Flagsmith. GitHub.com/flagsmith is where our source code is. And then we have a Discord community that you can find the link to anywhere. I think at docs.flagsmith.com. If you want to ask questions or help work on the platform, Discord's the best place to go for that. Yep.
Great. And for Cerbos, you can find us at cerbos.dev. We have a Slack community, not Discord, though that's up for debate, where we all hang out, team around the world. You can also book a free workshop where you get to speak to, unfortunately, me or someone else on the team, to go into kind of throw your authorization requirements, and we'll get you all up and running and writing policies in no time. So finally, thank you very much again. Anyone listening in, we will be sending out a version of this webinar recorded shortly, along with all the links and resources we spoke about. And with that, enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, and take care, and speak to you all soon.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's great.
Cheers.